The old wooden benches of courtroom 7 groaned under the weight of curious onlookers. Every seat was taken for what folks were calling the trial of the decade in the small town of Pine Creek. The air felt heavy with tension, like the moments before a summer storm breaks. Detective Ray Wilson slipped into the back row just as the doors closed. Droplets of rain still clung to his dark blue jacket as he settled in, trying not to draw attention. The 40-year-old federal agent had spent 20 years building a reputation for staying invisible until the right moment. Today was no different. As an African-American federal agent working undercover, Ray wasn't there for the murder case everyone was whispering about. His real assignment was the Pine Creek Police Department itself. 6 complaints of evidence tampering in the last year. 12 cases of excessive force, all involving people of color. 3 suspicious deaths in custody with paperwork that didn't add up. Just observe and report, his supervisor had told him 2 weeks ago. We need concrete proof before we can move forward with a federal investigation. Ray looked like any other concerned citizen in his faded jeans and work boots. The only thing that set him apart was his eyes, sharp and missing nothing as they scanned the room. Nobody would guess he carried a badge that could silence half the room if revealed. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. To his left, 2 elderly women traded theories about the defendant. On his right, a reporter scribbled furiously in a notebook. Everyone fell silent as the side door opened and Officer Doug Miller strutted in. Miller walked with the confidence of a man who believed the world was created for his convenience. His police uniform was pressed to perfection, brass buttons gleaming under the fluorescent lights. At 6'3" with shoulders like a linebacker, Miller had the kind of presence that could control a room without saying a word. The prosecution calls Officer Douglas Miller to the stand, announced the district attorney, a thin woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose. Ray watched Miller swagger to the witness box. Everything about the officer's body language screamed arrogance, from the way he raised his right hand for the oath without being asked, to how he adjusted his belt before sitting down, making sure everyone could see his holstered gun. Officer Miller, how long have you served with the Pine Creek Police Department? The DA asked. 15 years this March, ma'am, Miller answered, his voice carrying to the back of the room without effort. And prior to that? Military police. 2 tours in Iraq. Miller's chest puffed slightly with pride. The questioning continued as Ray observed quietly. He'd read Miller's personnel file before coming to Pine Creek. Decorated officer, 4 commendations for bravery, but also 7 complaints of excessive force that mysteriously disappeared. Witness statements that changed overnight. Body camera, footage that went missing during critical moments. As Miller testified about finding the murder weapon, Ray noticed small inconsistencies in his story. The times didn't match the official report. The description of the crime scene had extra details that weren't documented anywhere. The defense attorney, a young man who looked fresh out of law school, struggled to challenge Miller's confident testimony. Every time he tried to point out a contradiction, Miller had a ready explanation that made the lawyer look foolish. The gun was clearly visible on the kitchen counter, Miller insisted, though the crime scene photos showed it partially, hidden behind a toaster. Ray glanced at the jury. They were eating up every word. He understood why. Miller looked like a cop from a TV show. Handsome, confident, heroic. The defendant, a young Hispanic man named Luis Vega, sat with slumped shoulders already defeated. As the morning wore on, Ray started taking notes in a small book. Nothing obvious, just times and key phrases that didn't add up. He'd learned long ago that corruption rarely showed itself in big, dramatic ways. It was the small inconsistencies that eventually unraveled even the best cover-ups. The judge called for a lunch recess, and the courtroom began to empty. Ray stayed seated, watching Miller accept congratulations from the prosecution team like a celebrity greeting fans. The officer's laugh boomed across the now half-empty courtroom. Ray stood finally, stretching discreetly. He planned to grab lunch at the diner across the street, where courthouse employees tended to gather. Listening to casual conversation often revealed more than formal interviews ever could. As he moved toward the exit, he heard Miller's voice getting louder. The officer was in the side hallway with two other cops, all of them blocking the narrow passage. Can you believe that defense? Lawyer. Kid probably still needs his mommy to tie his shoes, Miller laughed. The other officers chuckled on cue. These people always think they can beat the system, Miller continued, not noticing Ray approaching. But we know how to handle them, right? Ray slowed his pace, all senses on alert. This was exactly the kind of conversation he needed to document. Excuse me, Ray said politely, needing to pass through the group to reach the exit. Miller turned, seemingly annoyed at the interruption. His eyes narrowed as he looked Ray up and down, lingering a moment too long on his face. Court's in recess, buddy. Public's supposed to use the main exit, Miller said, making no move to step aside. That door's blocked by the media, Ray explained, calmly. The bailiff said we could use this hallway. Something flashed in Miller's eyes, a mixture of suspicion and automatic authority that Ray had seen countless times before. It was the look of a man used to being obeyed without question, especially by people who looked like Ray. You been watching me in there? Miller asked, taking a step closer. Seem mighty interested in police business? The two officers behind, Miller exchanged glances, their hands instinctively moving closer to their belts. Just doing my civic duty, Ray replied with a careful smile. Interesting case. The first confrontation had begun, though neither man knew yet how significantly. This moment would change both their lives. Ray's stomach growled as he stood his ground in the narrow hallway. The confrontation with Officer Miller had drawn the attention of several courthouse workers who slowed their pace, sensing the tension in the air. Just passing through, Ray repeated calmly, meeting Miller's glare without flinching. Miller glanced at his fellow officers, then back at Ray. Something about the calm way this stranger refused to be intimidated seemed to bother him even more than open defiance would have. Fine, Miller finally said, stepping aside just enough to create a narrow path. Enjoy your lunch. As Ray moved past, he felt Miller's shoulder bump hard against his own. The contact was deliberate, not enough to call assault, but enough to send a message. Ray kept walking, feeling Miller's eyes burning into his back. The small diner across from the courthouse was packed with the lunch crowd. Ray found a quiet corner booth and ordered a coffee while he reviewed his notes. The waitress, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, brought him a menu. Watching the big trial? She asked, noticing his notebook. Just interested in how justice works around here, Ray replied with a friendly smile. She lowered her voice. Well, if you want justice, you might be in the wrong town. Before she could elaborate, the bell above the door jingled. Officer Miller and his two colleagues strutted in like they owned the place. The diner fell noticeably quieter. Ray didn't look up from his notes, but he could feel Miller's presence moving through the room. Sure enough, the officer's heavy footsteps stopped right beside his table. Well, look who it is, Miller said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Still taking notes, buddy? Ray glanced up, his expression neutral. Free country. Miller slid uninvited into the seat across from Ray, leaning forward with his forearms on the table. The other two officers took positions at the counter, effectively blocking the exit. You know what I think? Miller said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. I think you're some kind of reporter or maybe one of those police watchdog types. Coming into my town, trying to make trouble. Ray took a slow sip of his coffee. Your town? Miller's jaw tightened. Been keeping the peace here for 15 years. These people respect what we do. He gestured around the diner where several customers were now staring at their plates, deliberately avoiding eye contact. We've got a system that works. Seems that system works better for some than others, Ray commented, thinking of the case files he'd reviewed. Miller's face darkened. You don't know anything about what we deal with day in, day out. I know quite a bit about police work, Ray said carefully. The officer leaned closer. Let me give you some free advice. Whatever you're looking for, you won't find it here. Best, head back to whatever big city you came from. The waitress approached cautiously. Ready to order, gentlemen? He was just leaving, Miller said, not taking his eyes off Ray. Ray closed his notebook slowly. Actually, I'll take the special. And another coffee, please. The defiance was subtle but clear. Miller's nostrils flared as he stood up, towering, over the table. "Enjoy your lunch," he said through clenched teeth, then walked away to join his colleagues. Ray ate quietly, watching Miller from the corner of his eye. The officer kept shooting glares his way while bragging loudly to his friends about past arrests. The stories grew more disturbing as Miller's voice rose. "You should have seen this guy's face when I dragged him out of that car," Miller boasted. "Thought his fancy lawyer would save him. Nobody saves you when you disrespect an officer in this town." Ray paid his bill and left a generous tip. As he headed back to the courthouse, he noticed Miller and his friends following at a distance. The afternoon session was about to begin when Ray entered the courtroom. He found his previous seat taken, forcing him to move closer to the front, just 3 rows behind the prosecution table. This put him directly in Miller's line of sight as the officer returned to the witness stand. The defense attorney continued his cross-examination, growing more confident as he pressed Miller on the inconsistencies in his testimony. "Officer Miller, you testified that the defendant's fingerprints were on the murder weapon, correct?" "That's right," Miller answered. "Then how do you explain this report from your own forensics department stating that the only prints found belonged to the victim?" A murmur went through the courtroom. Miller shifted in his seat, his confidence visibly shaken for the first time. "Must be a mistake in the report," he insisted. Ray watched the jury exchanging glances. They were starting to doubt. Miller noticed too, his eyes darting from the jury to the defense attorney. Then his gaze landed on Ray, who was taking notes again. When the judge called another short recess, Ray headed to the water fountain in the hallway. He could hear urgent whispers from the prosecution team huddled with Miller near the courtroom doors. "You told us those prints were solid," the district attorney hissed. "They are," Miller insisted. "That lab guy must have screwed up the paperwork." "This is a disaster," another prosecutor said. "If they dig into the other evidence—" They fell, silent as Ray approached. Miller stepped directly into his path, forcing Ray to stop abruptly. "Still enjoying the show?" Miller asked, his voice dangerously low. "Just getting some water," Ray replied evenly. Miller moved closer, invading Ray's personal space. "I know what you're doing. You think you're so smart with your little notebook. People who cause trouble around here tend to find themselves in difficult situations." The threat hung in the air between them. Ray met Miller's gaze steadily. "That sounds an awful lot like a threat, officer." "Take it however you want," Miller growled. The courtroom doors opened as people began filing back in. Miller deliberately bumped Ray's shoulder again, harder this time, causing him to step back. "Watch where you're going," Ray said, still keeping his voice level. Something in Miller snapped. Maybe it was the pressure of the cross-examination, or the fear that his case was unraveling, or simply the fact that this stranger wouldn't be intimidated. Whatever the reason, Miller's face contorted with rage. "You don't tell me what to do," he snarled. Before Ray could respond, Miller's hand shot out, striking him across the face with enough force to make a cracking sound that echoed through the hallway. Several jury members who were entering the courtroom froze in shock. Ray's head snapped to the side from the impact. For a moment, everyone stood perfectly still. Miller smirked, clearly expecting Ray to cower or flee. Instead, Ray slowly turned his face back toward Miller, a small trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth. His eyes were calm, almost pitying. "That," Ray said quietly, "was a very big mistake." The hallway outside courtroom 7 fell silent. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hold its tick as Officer Miller stood with his hand still raised, the echo of the slap lingering in the air. A court security guard took a hesitant step forward, unsure how to handle an officer who had just assaulted someone. The district attorney's mouth hung open in shock. From the doorway, several jury members watched with wide eyes, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and alarm. Miller recovered first, straightening his uniform with a sharp tug. "That's what happens when you disrespect an officer," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. His voice carried a false confidence, as if he expected applause for putting this stranger in his place. Ray touched his cheek, which was already starting to redden from the impact. His calm gaze never left Miller's face. "Are you done?" Ray asked quietly. Miller blinked, caught off guard by the lack of fear. You better watch your mouth or what? Ray interrupted. You'll hit me again? In front of all these witnesses? Ray gestured to the growing crowd. Courthouse staff, attorneys, members of the public, and those jury members all watching now. Miller glanced around, suddenly aware of his audience. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. You had no right to get in my way, Miller insisted, his voice losing some of its thunder. And you had no right to assault me, Ray replied evenly. But here we are. The judge appeared in the doorway, her black robe swishing as she took in the scene. What is going on out here? She demanded. Miller turned to her with practiced respect. Just handling a disruptive individual? Your Honor, everything's under control. He hit this man, Judge, called out one of the jury members, a middle-aged woman who had stepped fully into the hallway. I saw it with my own eyes. More murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Miller's face darkened. Your Honor, this man has been interfering with court proceedings, taking notes, asking questions. Taking notes is not a crime, Officer Miller, the judge cut in sharply. And even if this gentleman was being disruptive, which I have not observed, that would not give you the authority to physically assault him. Miller's jaw clenched. With all due respect, Your Honor, you don't understand the situation. This guy has been following me, watching me. He's clearly up to something. I am up to something, Ray said calmly, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket. Miller's hand instinctively moved toward his gun, his training kicking in at the motion. Don't you dare, the court security guard warned, finally stepping forward. Ray's movements remained deliberate and slow as he pulled out a small leather wallet. He flipped it open to reveal a gleaming gold badge. Special Agent Ray Wilson, Federal Bureau of Investigation, he announced, his voice carrying clearly down the hallway. I'm here investigating allegations of civil rights violations, evidence, tampering, and witness intimidation within the Pine Creek Police Department. The silence that followed was absolute. Miller's face went from red to white in seconds, his hand frozen halfway to his weapon. The other officers who had been backing him up took small steps backward, trying to distance themselves. That's not. You can't, Miller stammered, his confidence evaporating. Ray tucked his badge away, his manner still professional despite the red mark on his cheek. Officer Douglas Miller, you are now also under investigation for assaulting a federal agent. I suggest you remove your hand from your weapon and stand down. The judge recovered from her shock first. Bailiff, please secure Officer Miller's weapon and escort him to my chambers immediately. She turned to Ray. Agent Wilson, I presume, you'll want to join us? Ray nodded. Yes, Your Honor, and I'll need to contact my supervisor. As the bailiff approached cautiously, Miller seemed to shrink before everyone's eyes. His shoulders slumped, his chest deflated. The powerful presence that had commanded the courtroom earlier was gone, replaced by a man who suddenly realized the gravity of his actions. This is a mistake, Miller protested weakly as the bailiff took his service weapon. I didn't know he was FBI. Would it have made a difference, officer? Ray asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. If I'd been anyone else, a reporter, a concerned citizen, even the defendant's family member, would that have made your actions acceptable? Miller had no answer. The crowd parted as the bailiff led him toward the judge's chambers. Whispers erupted throughout the hallway. Several people pulled out phones, undoubtedly spreading the news. The district attorney approached Ray, her face pale. Agent Wilson, if your investigation concerns this case. My investigation now concerns this case, Ray interrupted gently. But it didn't start that way. I've been in town for 2 weeks, reviewing complaints and gathering evidence. Officer Miller's testimony today and his subsequent behavior will now become part of that review. One of Miller's fellow officers stepped forward, looking nervous. Sir, I want to make it clear that I had no knowledge of any wrongdoing. Ray held up a hand. Save it, officer. Right now, I need to speak with the judge and make some calls. Everyone else should return to the courtroom or step outside. As Ray followed the judge and the subdued Miller toward the chambers, he caught sight of Luis Vega, the defendant. The young man was staring at him with a mixture of confusion and Hope. His defense attorney was whispering urgently in his ear, gesturing at Ray. Inside the judge's chambers, Miller sat heavily in a chair, looking as though his world was collapsing around him. "I don't understand," he muttered. "Why is the FBI interested? In Pine Creek? We're just a small-town department." "Justice isn't measured by the size of the town, Officer Miller," Ray replied, pulling out his phone. "And patterns of misconduct don't become acceptable just because they happen in a place most people have never heard of." The judge settled behind her desk, her expression grim. "How long has this investigation been active, Agent Wilson?" 6 months of preliminary work. 2 weeks on the ground here," Ray answered honestly. "We received multiple complaints about similar cases. Evidence discrepancies, forced confessions, selective enforcement. What I witnessed today only confirms our concerns." Miller looked up, desperation in his eyes. "It was just a slap. One mistake. 15 years on the force and you're going to ruin me over one mistake?" Ray studied him for a long moment before answering. "No, Officer Miller. You ruined yourself with a pattern of choices that led to this moment. The slap wasn't the crime, it was just the evidence." As Ray dialed his supervisor's number, he knew that everything about the quiet little town of Pine Creek was about to change forever. News travels fast in small towns. By sunset, everyone in Pine Creek knew about what happened in the courthouse. People gathered in living rooms, diners, and front porches to share what they'd heard, each version more dramatic than the last. "Knocked him clean across the room," claimed one man at the local barbershop, though he hadn't been anywhere near the courthouse. "FBI's been watching us for months," whispered a waitress at the truck stop on the edge of town. "Got undercover agents everywhere." The truth, as usual, was both simpler and more complicated than the rumors. Ray sat in a borrowed office at the courthouse, a bag of ice pressed against his cheek as he spoke to his supervisor on the phone. The small room felt stuffy, but it offered privacy from the curious eyes that followed him everywhere now. "Yes, sir. My cover's blown," Ray explained. "But we've got something bigger now. Officer Miller assaulted me in front of multiple witnesses, including jury members from an active trial." He listened to the voice on the other end, nodding occasionally. "I understand the operation wasn't supposed to go this way, but this could be the break we needed." His desperation shows we're onto something real. Outside the office, the courthouse buzzed with activity despite the late hour. The judge had declared an emergency recess in the murder trial, sending the jury home with strict instructions not to discuss what they'd witnessed. The district attorney and her team huddled in conference rooms, reviewing case files with new, worried eyes. The defense attorney walked the halls with a stunned expression, suddenly finding himself at the center of a case much larger than he'd prepared for. Miller had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. His service weapon and badge were locked in the judge's safe. He'd left the courthouse through a back door, head down, escorted by 2 state troopers who had been called in specifically for that purpose. Ray's phone buzzed with a text message from the FBI field office in the state capitol. "Team arriving 6 a.m. tomorrow. Secure all evidence." He put down his ice pack and opened his laptop. There was work to be done tonight. The investigation had just accelerated from a marathon to a sprint. The next morning, Pine Creek woke to find black SUVs parked outside the police station. Men and women in FBI windbreakers moved purposefully between buildings, carrying boxes of documents and computer equipment. Yellow crime scene tape blocked off portions of the evidence room. At the small motel on the edge of town, Ray briefed the team that had arrived overnight. 8 agents crowded into his room, drinking bad coffee from paper cups as they reviewed what he'd gathered over the past 2 weeks. "Officer Miller is our entry point," Ray explained, pointing to a photo on the wall. "But our investigation suggests at least 3 other officers are involved in the pattern of misconduct. Chief Wilson may not be directly involved, but he's been signing off on false reports for years." A female agent raised her hand. "What about the murder case that was on trial?" "That's where it gets interesting," Ray replied, pulling out a folder. "Luis Vega, the defendant, has maintained his innocence from day one. The evidence against him hinged almost entirely on Officer Miller's testimony and a gun allegedly found in Vega's kitchen. The same gun that forensics reported had no fingerprints matching Vega's, despite Miller's claim otherwise. The team split up, each agent assigned to different aspects of the investigation. Some headed to the police station to continue securing evidence. Others went to interview witnesses from previous cases. Ray and 2 senior agents drove to the mayor's office for what promised to be an uncomfortable conversation. Mayor Franklin greeted them with a politician's smile that didn't reach his eyes. His office overlooked the town square, a room designed to impress visitors with its heavy wooden desk and framed photographs of the mayor with various state officials. "Agent Wilson," he said, extending his hand as if they were meeting at a church picnic rather than a federal investigation. "I hope we can clear up this unfortunate misunderstanding quickly." Ray ignored the offered hand. "This isn't a misunderstanding, Mayor. This is a federal investigation into systemic civil rights violations within your police department. We have evidence of evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and selective enforcement targeting minority residents." The mayor's smile faded. "That's a serious accusation against some well-respected officers." "Respect has to be earned," Ray replied. "And it can be lost in an instant, like when an officer assaults someone in full view of a jury." The mayor sank into his chair. "Officer Miller has been with us for 15 years. One mistake." "It wasn't one mistake," Ray interrupted, opening a folder on the desk between them. "We've documented 27 cases where evidence was mishandled, or reports were falsified under Miller's supervision. 7 cases where witnesses changed their statements after private meetings with him. 3 deaths in custody with inconsistent reports." The color drained from the mayor's face as he looked at the documents. "I had no idea." "That's part of the problem," said one of the other agents. "The system was designed to keep you from knowing. But ignorance isn't a defense when people's civil rights are being violated under your administration." Across town, the district attorney was having a similar reckoning. Her office had prosecuted dozens of cases based on evidence and testimony from Officer Miller and his colleagues. How many of those cases might need to be reopened? How many people were sitting in prison based on tainted evidence? By mid-afternoon, the local news vans had arrived. Reporters set up outside the police station, the courthouse, and the mayor's office, hungry for details about the federal investigation that had blindsided the town. The police station operated with a skeleton crew. Many officers called in sick, unwilling to face questions from FBI agents or reporters. Those who did show up walked carefully, speaking only when necessary, aware that everything they said might become evidence. Luis Vega remained in custody, but his attorney filed an emergency motion for dismissal based on the new evidence of officer misconduct. The judge scheduled a hearing for the following morning. At the end of the day, Ray stood on the steps of the courthouse, watching as the small town grappled with uncomfortable truths. An elderly black man approached him slowly, leaning on a cane. "My grandson was arrested by Officer Miller 3 years ago," the man said without introduction. Nobody believed him when he said Miller planted that gun, not even me. I thought he was just making excuses. Ray nodded, understanding the weight of the man's words. "Will you be looking at old cases too?" the man asked, hope and doubt mixing in his voice. "Yes, sir," Ray answered firmly. "Every case Miller touched will be reviewed. If your grandson was wrongfully convicted, we'll find the evidence to prove it." The man's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," he whispered. Some of us stopped believing justice was possible in this town. As the sun set over Pine Creek, Ray knew this was just the beginning. Dismantling years of misconduct wouldn't happen overnight. Some wounds couldn't be healed with arrests and new policies. But the first difficult step had been taken. The truth, so long buried in file cabinets and whispered conversations, was finally coming to light. 6 months passed. The leaves in Pine Creek had changed colors, fallen, and now fresh green buds dotted the trees again. Spring brought new beginnings, and for some, a final reckoning. The old courthouse looked the same from the outside, but inside the atmosphere had transformed. Gone was the casual arrogance that had once ruled these halls. In its place was a cautious respect for procedure and rights that had been too long ignored. Courtroom 7 was packed beyond capacity for the sentencing hearing. Officer Doug Miller sat at the defendant's table in a gray suit that seemed to hang loosely on his frame. The past 6 months had aged him visibly, deep lines etched around his mouth, gray streaking his once dark hair. His eyes, once filled with authority and confidence, now darted nervously around the room. Ray Wilson sat in the back row, just as he had that first day 6 months ago. But today he made no attempt to blend in. His badge was visible on his belt, his presence acknowledged with nods from courthouse staff and attorneys alike. The changes in Pine Creek went far beyond this one case. The police department had been completely restructured under state supervision. The chief had resigned in disgrace after evidence showed he had knowingly covered up misconduct for years. Half the force had been replaced with new officers who underwent enhanced training in community policing and civil rights. The mayor had narrowly survived a recall election, promising reforms and oversight that should have been in place years ago, but the most profound changes were in the lives of those who had been wrongfully convicted, based on fabricated evidence and false testimony. 17 cases had been overturned so far, with more under review. Men and women who had lost years behind bars were returning to their families, trying to rebuild lives that had been shattered by injustice. Luis Vega, the young man whose murder trial had started it all, had been fully exonerated. The charges were dismissed when a review of the evidence revealed that Officer Miller had planted the supposed murder weapon. The real killer had been identified through proper police work by one of the new detectives brought in during the department overhaul. The judge entered the courtroom, and everyone rose. Her gaze swept over the crowd, lingering briefly on Ray, before settling on Miller. "Please be seated," she said. When everyone had complied, she continued, "We are here for the sentencing of Douglas Miller, former officer of the Pine Creek Police Department." Miller had pled guilty to multiple charges: assault on a federal officer, evidence tampering, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice. The plea deal had spared him the maximum sentence but still guaranteed substantial prison time. "Mr. Miller, do you wish to address the court before sentencing?" the judge asked. Miller rose slowly, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the table for support. When he spoke, his voice was barely recognizable from the booming, confident tone he had once used to command respect. "Your Honor, I've had a lot of time to think about how I got here," he began. "When I joined the force, I wanted to protect people. I believed in the badge and what it stood for." He paused, swallowing hard. "Somewhere along the way, I started to think the badge meant I was above the rules instead of sworn to uphold them. I convinced myself that cutting corners was necessary for justice. But it wasn't justice I was serving. It was my own ego." Miller turned slightly, his gaze moving across the spectators. "I see faces here today of people whose lives I damaged, people I swore to protect, but instead betrayed. Nothing I can say will give them back the time they lost or heal the pain I caused. All I can say is that I'm sorry, and I accept whatever punishment the court decides is appropriate." He sat down heavily, shoulders slumped in defeat. The judge studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. Miller, you're right that words cannot undo the harm you've caused. The breach of trust is perhaps the most serious aspect of your crimes. When those entrusted to uphold the law instead break it, the damage extends beyond individual victims to the very foundation of our justice system." She glanced down at the papers before her. "Based on your plea agreement and the sentencing guidelines, I hereby sentence you to 5 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are permanently barred from serving in any law enforcement capacity." The gavel struck with a crisp finality that echoed through the courtroom. As the bailiff led Miller away, Ray watched with mixed emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served, but no joy in watching a man's fall, even a man who had brought it upon himself through years of abuse and misconduct. Outside the courthouse, Ray found himself approached by a small group of people. He recognized them as family members of those who had been wrongfully convicted. An older woman stepped forward. "Agent Wilson, my son came home last week after 3 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit," she said. her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. Because of your work, he can see his children grow up. Thank you. One by one, they shared similar stories. A brother who could now attend college as he'd always dreamed. A father who could walk his daughter down the aisle at her wedding. Lives reclaimed from the shadow of injustice. As the group dispersed, Ray was left with his supervisor, who had come for the sentencing. Quite a case, the older agent commented. Started with a slap and ended up changing an entire town. Ray nodded, looking out at Pine Creek spread below them. From this height it looked peaceful, picturesque even, a small town like thousands of others across the country. One bad cop doesn't usually bring down a whole department, Ray said thoughtfully. It took a system willing to look the other way, people who valued convenience over justice. And it took one moment of arrogance, his supervisor added. Miller never would have slapped you if he hadn't been absolutely certain he could get away with it. Ray touched his cheek, remembering the sting of that slap months ago. That's the thing about believing you're untouchable, he said quietly. It makes you sloppy. And sooner or later, justice catches up. As they walked down the courthouse steps, Ray noticed a group of new police recruits watching a training session across the street. Their instructor was explaining community engagement techniques, emphasizing respect and communication. Pine Creek would never be perfect. No place ever is. But with each small step toward accountability and fairness, it was becoming something better than it had been. For Ray, that was enough to call this case a success. Justice hadn't just been served in a courtroom today. It had been planted like those new spring buds, with the promise of growth and deeper roots for the future.